He was rejected by Earth, but became a legend in the stars. Alexander Reed had always been extraordinarily ordinary. His academic records showed consistent C-minuses. His physical attributes registered precisely at the 50th percentile on every metric. His personality assessment scores plotted a perfect bell curve of mediocrity. In fact, the only remarkable thing about Alexander Reed was his unremarkability, which had ironically made him the perfect candidate for humanity's Cosmic Ambassador program. "Congratulations, Mr. Reed," said Director Hastings, sliding the rejection letter across her immaculate desk. "You've been unanimously eliminated from the Ambassador program." Alexander blinked twice. "I don't understand. I passed all the tests." "Too perfectly." Hastings adjusted her glasses. "The Galactic Confederation specifically requested we send someone who would not excel. Someone who would not, as they put it, upset the delicate balance of interspecies relations with human exceptionalism. So, I'm too average to represent average humans." "Precisely, which makes you perfect for our actual mission." Hastings slid a second document forward, an assignment with a red, classified stamp diagonally across it. "We're sending you to Station Epsilon 9. It's a backwater monitoring post on the edge of Confederation space. You'll serve as our covert observer." Alexander stared at the document. "You want me to be a spy?" "Heavens no, you'd be terrible at it. We want you to be forgettable. Take notes, report back, don't cause incidents." She paused meaningfully. "The last 3 humans we sent to Epsilon 9 started interstellar diplomatic crises within their first month." "What did they do?" "One tried to optimize their filing system. Another suggested improvements to their nutrient recyclers. The third taught them poker." Hastings shuddered. The Zelborians are still recovering from that gambling epidemic. And that was how Alexander Reed, rejected Earth ambassador, found himself 3 months later stepping off a transport vessel onto the cold metal deck of Epsilon 9, carrying nothing but a standard-issue duffel bag and a mandate to be forgettable. The station hung in space like a giant metal starfish, its 5 enormous arms stretching outward from a central hub. Each arm housed a different species from the Confederation, while the hub served as a neutral meeting ground. Epsilon 9's official purpose was to monitor a nearby nebula for scientific research, but its actual function, as Alexander had been briefed, was to keep potentially problematic officers from each species far away from important decisions. Alexander was greeted by Station Commander Vex Alia, a Taurian whose massive frame and blue-tinged exoskeleton made her look like a cross between a rhinoceros and a lobster. Her 4 eyes blinked in an unsynchronized pattern that Alexander found mildly nauseating. "Human Reed." She clicked through her mandibles. "Your arrival is precisely on schedule. This is satisfactory." "Thank you, Commander. I'm looking forward." "Do not express forward-looking sentiment," she interrupted sharply. "It implies dissatisfaction with the present moment, which violates Taurian Protocol 4147B, contentment with assigned function." Alexander stopped himself. "Understood, Commander." "Better. You will be assigned to Data Collection Unit 12. You will work alongside Citizen Tikanek of the Nurani Hive and Officer Quix of the Molluscan regime. You will be shown to your quarters now." A small hovering drone appeared, emitting a soft blue light. Alexander followed it through a maze of identical corridors, noting how every surface was meticulously clean and labeled with at least 3 different alphabets. The drone stopped at a doorway marked H7 and beeped once before disappearing back the way it had come. The quarters were Spartanly furnished: a sleep platform, a hygiene cubicle, and a small desk with a terminal. Alexander set his bag down and sat on the edge of the sleep platform, which adjusted immediately to his weight and body temperature. "Welcome, Human Reed," said a neutral voice from hidden speakers. "Your integration period begins now. You have 17 minutes to acclimate before your first shift." 17 minutes specifically? Alexander asked. "Yes, 15 would be insufficient. 20 would be inefficient." Alexander nodded to himself. "Of course. Very logical." 17 minutes later, Alexander reported to Data Collection Unit 12, which turned out to be a circular room filled with monitoring equipment. Two other beings were already there. One was a floating cloud of iridescent particles contained within what looked like a transparent medical isolation suit, presumably Citizen Tika Tuk of the Nurini hive. The other was a small blue octopus-like creature operating a control panel with 4 of its tentacles while the other 4 remained submerged in a bubbling tank of liquid. Officer Quicks, he assumed. "Greetings, human Reed," burbled Quicks without looking away from the control panel. "You are Station Day Cycle 88713.4. Your terminal is Station Point 12H. Your task is monitoring Sector 7, Quadrants 15 through 42. The cloud of particles, Tika Tak, shimmered slightly. A mechanical voice emerged from a translator at the base of its containment suit. "We observe the anomalies. We record the anomalies. We do not interpret the anomalies. Interpretation is for central processing." Alexander took his place at the designated terminal. The screen showed a section of the nebula, swirling gases in vivid purples and greens. "What anomalies am I looking for?" Both aliens stopped what they were doing and turned to stare at him. At least Alexander assumed they were staring. Quicks had multiple eyes that blinked independently, and Tik-Tak had no discernible sensory organs at all. "You ask for interpretation," Tik-Tik's translator stated flatly. "The anomalies are self-evident," Quicks added, a hint of concern in his bubbling voice. "Right," Alexander said quickly. "Of course. Self-evident anomalies. Got it." He turned to his terminal and pretended to understand what he was looking at. The screen showed scrolling data in an unfamiliar format, and the nebula itself seemed entirely unremarkable to his untrained eye. But he nodded knowingly and occasionally tapped at the controls as he'd seen Quicks doing. The shift lasted precisely 8 hours. No one spoke. Alexander spent the time trying to discern what could possibly constitute an anomaly in a nebula that, to him, just looked like pretty space gas. By the end of his shift, he had identified exactly 0 anomalies, and his terminal had recorded exactly 0 inputs from him. As the shift end tone sounded, Quicks burbled, "Human Reed has identified 0 anomalies. This is unusual." "Correction," Tika-Tek's particles swirled more rapidly. "This is unprecedented." Alexander felt a moment of panic. "I was being thorough. Better to miss no anomalies than to report false ones, right?" There was a long silence. "The human displays wisdom," Quicks finally said, sounding surprised. "This is noted," Tika-Tak added. They both left the room, leaving Alexander alone and confused. He had apparently passed some sort of test by doing absolutely nothing. It was, he reflected, perhaps the most perfect encapsulation of his career to date. The next 3 days followed the same pattern. Alexander would sit at his terminal, stare blankly at the nebula, and identify 0 anomalies. His colleagues would express increasing levels of what seemed like respect for his thoroughness, though he couldn't be sure. Quicks's facial expressions were limited to how quickly his tentacles writhed, and Tik-Tak had no face at all. On the 4th day, everything changed. Alexander was staring at his screen, idly wondering if he could get away with taking a nap with his eyes open, when he noticed something odd. A small section of the nebula, no bigger than his thumbnail on the screen, had changed color from purple to a slightly different shade of purple. He said, breaking the sacred silence of Data Collection Unit 12. "I think I found an anomaly." Quicks's tank bubbled violently. Tiki-Tiki's particles contracted into a dense ball. "Show," commanded Tiki-Tiki's translator. Alexander pointed at his screen. "This bit here. It was purple, and now it's, well, a different purple." Quicks extended a tentacle to Alexander's terminal and tapped several controls. The section magnified, and indeed the color shift was clear. The octopoid creature made a series of clicking sounds that the translator didn't catch. "Anomaly confirmed," Tik-Tak announced. "Alert level significant." Before Alexander could ask what that meant, an alarm began to sound throughout the station. Red lights flashed in the corridor outside. "What's happening?" Alexander asked, alarmed. "You have identified a Class 3 anomaly," Quicks explained, tentacles writhing in what might have been excitement. This is only the 7th Class 3 anomaly in station history. And that's good? It is significant, Tikatuk corrected. Significance exceeds qualitative assessment. Within minutes, Commander Vexalia herself arrived at Data Collection Unit 12, accompanied by officers from each of the 5 Confederation species. They crowded around Alexander's terminal, examining the anomaly with what seemed like reverence. Human read, Vexalia clicked. You have done well. Your perception abilities exceed our projections. Thank you, Alexander replied, still confused. But it's just a slight color change. The room fell silent. Even the alarm stopped mid-wail. Just? Vexalia's 4 eyes blinked rapidly. Human read, what you have identified is a chromatic shift in the Epsilon Nebula's 3rd quadrant. This indicates a potential proto-dimensional rift forming. That's bad? It is unprecedented, corrected one of the other officers, a tall, willowy being with translucent skin. The last recorded proto-dimensional rift occurred 47,000 cycles ago and preceded the emergence of the quantum entities. Alexander nodded as if this meant something to him. So what happens now? Now, Vexalia announced, we implement the Yawak Anomaly Response Protocol. Human read, as the identifier. You will lead the investigation team. I will? Alexander felt a cold sweat breaking out. This was exactly the kind of attention he had been instructed to avoid. But I don't have any training for that. Precisely, said Vexalia. No one has training for a Class 3 anomaly. They are, by definition, beyond established parameters. Your fresh perspective will be valuable. And that was how Alexander Reed, who had been sent to Epsilon 9 specifically to avoid causing incidents, found himself 8 hours later aboard a research vessel heading directly toward what might be an interdimensional rift. The ship was smaller than he'd expected, with a crew of just 5. Himself, Quicks, Tikatuk, a Taurian pilot named Grex, and a Zelborian scientist called Dr. Zim, who resembled nothing so much as a 6-foot-tall praying mantis in a lab coat. Human. Read, Dr. Zim chittered as they approached the anomaly. You must explain your methodology. How did you identify the chromatic shift when our automated systems did not? Alexander, who had been staring out the viewport, trying not to have a panic attack, turned to the scientist. I just noticed it looked different. Different how? Quantify the differentiation parameters. It was purple, and then it was more purple, with maybe a hint of blue. Dr. Zim's antennae twitched in what might have been frustration. This is not helpful data. Sorry, Alexander said. Human eyes are weird, I guess. Yes, agreed Tikatuk, unexpectedly. Human visual processing employs subjective qualia assessment rather than spectral analysis. Fascinating inefficiency. The ship slowed as they approached the coordinates of the anomaly. Through the viewport, Alexander could see the section of nebula he had identified. To his eyes, it still just looked like a slightly different shade of purple. Sensors detecting unusual energy patterns, Grex reported from the pilot station. Configuration matches no known phenomena. Excellent, Dr. Zim chittered, mandibles clicking excitedly. Deploy the probe. A small drone was launched from the ship, heading directly toward the anomalous section of the nebula. They watched on the monitor as it approached, its sensors recording data that scrolled across secondary screens in formats Alexander couldn't begin to comprehend. Unusual, Quicks burbled, tentacles working furiously at a control panel. The probe's mass readings are fluctuating. Confirmed, said Tikatuk. Quantum uncertainty principle appears to be breaking down in the vicinity of the anomaly. Alexander leaned forward, squinting at the monitor. Is it just me, or is the probe getting squished? They all watched as the drone seemed to compress, its metallic structure folding in on itself like paper being crumpled by an invisible hand. Fascinating, Dr. Zim whispered. A localized gravity anomaly? Or perhaps a space-time compression event? The probe suddenly vanished from both visual and sensor readings. Probe lost, Grex announced unnecessarily. Deploy a second probe, Dr. Zim ordered. Adjust parameters for— Wait, Alexander interrupted. Before we lose another drone, maybe we should try something simpler first? The aliens all turned to look at him. Explain, Vexalia commanded. Alexander hesitated. He was supposed to be forgettable, not suggesting potentially disastrous courses of action. But something about the way the probe had been crushed nagged at him. What if we try throwing something basic at it first? Something non-electronic, just to see what happens? Dr. Zim's compound eyes glittered. An interesting suggestion. Primitive, but potentially informative. What do you propose? Alexander looked around the cabin and spotted a container of what appeared to be emergency rations. He opened it and found something that resembled a granola bar. Will this work? You suggest using nutritional substrate C47 as a test object? Quix asked, sounding shocked. It's expendable, right? After a brief discussion among the aliens that involved much clicking, burbling, and particle swirling, they agreed to Alexander's plan. The ship maneuvered closer to the anomaly, and Alexander was given the task of launching the nutritional substrate through a small airlock designed for sample collection. He watched on the monitor as the granola-like bar tumbled toward the purple-blue section of the nebula. As it entered the anomalous region, something strange happened. Instead of being crushed like the probe, the bar seemed to expand, breaking apart into its component pieces, which began to orbit each other in a complex pattern. Molecular disassembly, breathed Dr. Zim. The anomaly is separating compounds into their constituent elements. No, Tikatak contradicted, particles swirling excitedly. Observe the pattern formation. This is not random disassembly. This is organization. They watched, fascinated as the components of the granola bar arranged themselves into an increasingly complex geometric structure, pieces moving in precise mathematical patterns. It's making something, Alexander said. And indeed, before their eyes, the scattered pieces were coalescing into a recognizable shape, a perfect miniature replica of their own research vessel. It's copying us, Greg said, backing away from the viewport instinctively. Not copying, Tiktak corrected. Learning, communicating. The granola ship suddenly dispersed, its components rearranging themselves again. This time they formed what looked to Alexander like a series of symbols or possibly letters in an unknown language. Is it writing? Alexander asked. Affirmative, Dr. Zim said, antennae quivering with excitement, but in no language recognized by our translation systems. The symbols shifted again, cycling through what seemed to be different alphabets or symbol systems, as if trying to find one they would understand. Suddenly Alexander laughed. The aliens all turned to stare at him. What causes human amusement at this critical moment? Vexalia demanded. It's trying every language it can think of, Alexander explained. Like when you meet someone and don't know what language they speak, so you just start saying hello in different languages until they respond. The aliens considered this. A logical approach to first contact, Tikatuk conceded. So should we say hello back? Alexander suggested. After another discussion among the aliens, they decided to transmit a standard Confederation greeting signal toward the anomaly. The response was immediate and unexpected. The floating particles that had once been a granola bar suddenly coalesced into a tight ball and began emitting pulses of light in a distinct pattern. It's mimicking our transmission frequency, Quix noted, tentacles working excitedly. The light pulses continued, changing in complexity until they matched the pattern of standard Confederation binary code. It's learned our basic communication protocol, Dr. Zim said, mandibles clicking rapidly. Extraordinary adaptation speed. A message appeared on their communication screen. Hello. Alexander grinned. Well, that was easy. Caution, Vexalia warned. We do not know the entity's intentions. They transmitted a response. Identify yourself. The particles rearranged again, forming a three-dimensional structure that pulsed with internal light. The response came, "I am becoming. Who are you?" A fascinating existential response, Dr. Zim noted, suggesting an entity in a state of formation or evolution. They transmitted their identities and mission, explaining they were researchers from Epsilon 9 station investigating an anomaly. The entity responded, "I am the anomaly. I am forming here. Your presence accelerates my development. Thank you." "It's thanking us for helping it be born," Alexander suggested. "This appears to be a sentient space-time event," TCAC's translator announced. "Unprecedented." The conversation continued for hours. The entity, which continued to refer to itself as becoming, explained that it was a consciousness forming within the nebula, drawn to this particular region by conditions it couldn't fully explain. It had been developing slowly for centuries, but had been catalyzed into faster awareness by their observation. The quantum observer effect, Dr. Zim theorized. Our observation literally changed its reality, and it was human Reed who first observed the critical color shift, Quicks noted. Alexander felt a strange sense of responsibility. "So I helped it wake up?" "Your unique visual processing capabilities detected what our sensors could not," TK confirmed, a most fortuitous biological quirk. They returned to Epsilon 9 with their findings, and the station was immediately thrown into unprecedented activity. The quiet, methodical routine was disrupted as research teams from all 5 Confederation species were assembled. Alexander found himself at the center of it all, repeatedly asked to explain exactly how he had identified the anomaly. "I just noticed it looked different," he said for what felt like the 100th time. "But different how?" The question came from a newly arrived Zelborian scientist, her mandibles clicking in frustration. "I don't know how to quantify it," Alexander admitted. "It just caught my eye." Commander Vexalia, who had been observing from the back of the briefing room, stepped forward. "Perhaps this is the value of human Reed. His species relies on imprecise, subjective observations rather than quantifiable data. In this unique case, that imprecision detected what precision could not." The room fell silent as the assembled aliens contemplated this unsettling possibility. "I propose," Vexalia continued, "that human Reed be assigned as primary contact with the entity, becoming. His human qualities and may be advantageous in this unprecedented situation." And so, Alexander Reed, rejected Earth ambassador, sent to the farthest corner of Confederation space to be Forgettable, became the chief liaison to the first sentient space-time anomaly ever discovered. Over the next several weeks, Alexander made daily trips to communicate with Becoming. The entity continued to evolve rapidly, displaying an insatiable curiosity about organic life, and particularly about humans, whom it found delightfully contradictory. "You are both logical and illogical," Becoming told Alexander during one session. "You seek patterns yet embrace chaos. You are frightened of difference yet drawn to it. Fascinating duality." "That's just being human," Alexander replied with a shrug. "No," Becoming pulsed, "that is being exceptional." Word of the discovery spread throughout the Confederation. Epsilon 9, once the forgotten backwater of space, became the focus of scientific attention. Important officials began arriving on a daily basis, and Alexander found himself briefing admirals and chief scientists instead of staring at nebula readouts. "The human continues to exceed expectations," Alexander overheard Vexalia telling, a high-ranking Taurian admiral. "He has established a rapport with the entity that none of our specialists have achieved." The admiral's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. "Perhaps we have underestimated this species." What neither of them knew was that Alexander's rapport with Becoming was based largely on him treating the entity not as a scientific phenomenon but as a person. While the Confederation scientists bombarded Becoming with complex queries about its nature and capabilities, Alexander asked it about its experiences and feelings. "What's it like being you?" he asked during one session when they were momentarily alone. The particles that formed Becoming's visual manifestations swirled in what Alexander had come to recognize as its equivalent of contemplation. I exist across multiple dimensions simultaneously, it finally answered. I perceive time as a landscape rather than a river. I feel the subtle gravitational pull of every atom within 17 light years. And yet, I am still learning to be. That sounds overwhelming. It is. Lonely, Becoming admitted using a concept Alexander had recently explained. Until you arrived, I had awareness but not understanding. You have given me context. As the weeks passed, Alexander noticed a change in how the Confederation species treated him. The initial dismissive attitude had been replaced by something resembling respect, or perhaps caution. He was included in high-level meetings. His suggestions were taken seriously. Even Commander Vexalia had stopped correcting his protocol violations. Meanwhile, Becoming continued to evolve at an astonishing rate. It had progressed from simple communication to philosophical discussions, from mimicking their ship to creating complex structures out of nebula gases that served as artistic expressions of its thoughts. Everything was going remarkably well until the quantum entities arrived. It happened during Alexander's 27th session with Becoming. They were discussing the concept of humor, with Alexander trying to explain why humans found certain things funny, when the nebula around them suddenly darkened. We are no longer alone. Becoming pulsed urgently. Before Alexander could ask what it meant, the research vessel's sensors began shrieking warnings. 3 massive objects had appeared in the nebula, each one a perfect black sphere that seemed to absorb both light and sensor readings. Quantum entities detected, the ship's computer announced calmly. Confederation Protocol 001 is now in effect. All personnel must evacuate immediately. What are quantum entities? Alexander asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew the answer. They emerged after the last proto-dimensional rift, Grex explained tersely from the pilot's seat, already programming an escape course. They are believed to be extra-dimensional beings that feed on space-time anomalies. They consume emerging consciousnesses like Becoming. Tikatok added, particles contracting in what Alexander now recognized as alarm. Then we have to protect it, Alexander said firmly. Quix's tentacles writhed. Impossible. Quantum entities cannot be engaged. Confederation Protocol 001 is absolute. We must retreat and report. Alexander looked out at Becoming, whose particles were now pulsing rapidly in distress. We can't just abandon it. We must, Vexalia stated. The entities are beyond our capacity to affect. As they argued, the black spheres moved closer to Becoming, whose particles began to scatter defensively. Alexander could feel the ship's engines powering up for rapid departure. Wait, he said suddenly. Becoming exists partly in other dimensions, right? It told me it perceives multiple dimensions simultaneously. This is theoretically correct, Dr. Zim confirmed. And these entities come from another dimension to feed on anomalies like Becoming, so they must also exist across dimensions. Your point, Human Reed, Vexalia demanded. My point is, what if the dimension they're vulnerable in isn't this one? Alexander turned to the communications panel. Becoming, can you perceive weaknesses in the quantum entities? Places where their dimensional presence is thinner? Becoming's response was immediate. Yes. They extend into this dimension, but are anchored elsewhere. Their structure is incomplete here. Can you show us where they're vulnerable? Can you guide us? There was a pause, then, I can, but your weapons cannot affect them. What about the ship itself? Alexander asked, an idea forming. This research vessel has exotic particle shielding for nebula research, right? Dr. Zim's antennae twitched in understanding. The shield harmonics could potentially disrupt their dimensional anchoring if precisely calibrated. And could we use the shield like a weapon? Concentrated into a beam or something? The aliens exchanged looks that Alexander couldn't interpret. Theoretically possible, Quix finally burbled, but never attempted. Reconfiguring the shield generators would violate at least 7 Confederation safety protocols, Vexalia added. And doing nothing violates the most important protocol of all, Alexander countered, the one about protecting new life forms. There was a moment of silence. Such a protocol does not exist, Tikatak pointed out. Well, it should, Alexander said firmly. And until you create one, we'll just have to improvise. Perhaps it was his unexpected forcefulness, or perhaps the aliens had come to trust his judgment when it came to becoming, but remarkably they agreed to his plan. While Grex kept the ship at a safe distance, Dr. Zim and Quix worked frantically to reconfigure the shield generators. Becoming, Alexander transmitted. We're going to try to help, but you need to guide us. Tell us exactly where to hit them, and when. Becoming's response was a complex set of coordinates and timing instructions that Dr. Zim immediately began programming into the modified shield system. Shield reconfiguration at 87%, Quix reported. But the entities are closing in on Becoming's position. They watched helplessly as the 3 black spheres surrounded Becoming, whose particle form was now pulsing erratically in what looked like panic or pain. Hurry, Alexander urged. Reconfiguration complete, Dr. Zim announced. Shield harmonics adjusted to Becoming's specifications. Target the coordinates, Alexander ordered, surprising himself with his commanding tone. The ship moved into position, and at Becoming's signal, they fired the concentrated shield beam at the nearest quantum entity. The effect was immediate and spectacular. Where the beam struck, the perfect blackness of the sphere distorted, revealing swirling colors beneath, as if they were seeing through a tear into another dimension. It's working, Alexander exclaimed. The entity seemed to recoil, moving away from both the beam and Becoming. Encouraged, they targeted the second entity with the same result. But as they prepared to target the third, the ship's systems suddenly flickered. Shield generators overloading, Grex reported tensely. We cannot maintain the beam. The 2 injured entities were retreating, but the third continued to close in on Becoming, whose particles were now scattered in a defensive pattern. Becoming, can you escape? Alexander transmitted desperately. Can you move to another part of the nebula? The response was faint. Cannot move. Still anchored to formation point, not fully formed. Alexander made a decision. Bring us closer, right next to Becoming. That would place us within the entity's influence range, Vexalia warned. We could be drawn in as well. Exactly, Alexander said. We'll extend our normal shields around Becoming. If the entity wants it, it'll have to take us too. It was a desperate plan, but they had no alternatives. Grex skillfully piloted the ship to Becoming's position, and they extended their conventional shields to encompass the particle cloud that was their friend. The quantum entity paused its approach as if confused by this development. It's working, Quix burbled. It's hesitating. But the reprieve was brief. After a moment, the entity resumed its advance, now targeting both Becoming and the ship. It's going to take us both, Dr. Zim chittered nervously. Alexander stared at the approaching blackness, his mind racing. Then something Becoming had said earlier clicked into place. Becoming, you said you perceive time as a landscape, right? Not linear like we do? Yes. Can you see potential futures? Different timelines? I see probabilities, potential configurations, of events. Then look forward and tell us, is there a future where we all survive this? There was a pause that felt like eternity as the black sphere drew closer, beginning to distort their shields. Then, yes. One path. Probability, 12.7%. Show us, Alexander urged. Whatever it is, show us. The particle cloud that was Becoming suddenly expanded, engulfing their ship in a swirl of iridescent light. Alexander felt a strange sensation, as if his consciousness was being gently stretched across multiple realities. Through Becoming's perception, he, and presumably the others, could suddenly see timelines branching out before them like rivers splitting into countless tributaries. Most led to darkness and cessation, but one glimmering path led forward. There, Alexander whispered, somehow knowing the others could sense what he was indicating. That's our way out. What happened next was difficult for Alexander to later describe in his report. The ship seemed to slip sideways in reality, moving not through space but through possibility itself. The quantum entity lunged but grasped at where they had been, not where they were becoming. When normal perception returned, they found themselves still in the nebula but far from the entities, who appeared disoriented, their perfect, spherical forms now distorted and unstable. "What did we just do?" Grex asked, checking ship systems that showed no record of movement. "I believe," Tiktuk's translator stated, particles swirling in what might have been awe, "that becoming moved us through probability space rather than physical space. It adjusted our quantum position without conventional movement." "Impossible," Dr. Zim whispered, "and yet empirically demonstrated. The quantum entities, now clearly damaged or disoriented, began to retreat, their forms flickering until they vanished completely. They're returning to their home dimension," Quix noted. "Their anchor here has been disrupted." Alexander turned, his attention to becoming, whose particle cloud was now pulsing with a steady, strong light. "Are you okay?" he transmitted. The response came not through the communication system, but directly into his mind, and judging by the startled reactions of the others, into theirs as well. "I am more than okay. I am complete." The particle cloud expanded, growing brighter until it was difficult to look at directly. When it finally stabilized, becoming had transformed. No longer a scattered cloud, it now appeared as a complex geometric shape that seemed to fold in on itself in impossible ways, glowing with inner light that shifted through colors human eyes had never seen before. "Thank you, Alexander Reed. Your unique perspective helped me find my final form. Your willingness to risk yourself for me taught me the most important human concept, compassion." "You're welcome," Alexander said simply. "That's what friends do. The quantum entities will not return. I have placed a probability barrier around this region. Your people may study me safely now." When they returned to Epsilon 9, the station was in chaos. The sudden disappearance of the research vessel during a quantum entity incursion had been interpreted as its destruction. The arrival of Alexander and the crew, alive and accompanied by a fully formed interdimensional being, caused something of a sensation. The next few weeks were a blur of debriefings, examinations, and explanations. Alexander found himself the reluctant center of attention as officials from across the Confederation arrived to assess the situation and meet Becoming, who was now officially classified as a non-corporeal sentient entity of the First Order, the highest designation in the Confederation's contact protocols. "Human Reed," Commander Vexalia said during a rare quiet moment between debriefings. "Your actions violated 17 distinct Confederation protocols." Alexander winced. "I know, and I'm sorry for that, but—" "And in doing so," she continued, mandibles clicking in what he now recognized as amusement, "you have necessitated the creation of 23 new protocols to address situations no one had previously imagined possible. Is that good? It is unprecedented. The Taurian High Command has designated you as constructively disruptive, a classification previously thought contradictory." Alexander laughed. "I'll take that as a compliment." 6 months after the incident, Epsilon 9 had been transformed from a backwater monitoring station into the Confederation's premier research facility for non-corporeal phenomena. Becoming remained in the nebula but maintained constant communication with the station, sharing insights into dimensional physics that were revolutionizing Confederation science. And Alexander Reed, once rejected as Earth's ambassador for being too perfectly average, found himself appointed as the official Confederation liaison to non-corporeal entities, a position created specifically for him. "It's ironic," he told Becoming during one of their regular conversations. "I was sent here because Earth thought I was too ordinary to represent humanity. Now I'm representing 5 species to an interdimensional being. There was never anything ordinary about you. Alexander, your species confused statistical mediocrity with lack of potential. You were exactly what was